stafninu. Þá eru þær hérna, já, í vinnumálastofnun, þessi hér.
Okay.
Já, það er bara að fara í full skrifa á þeim, sko. Þá eru toppmálum.
Okay.
Þessi er svo fyrir fyrirspurnir.
Já.
Þannig að þú ert ekki að
Okay.
því.
Já.
Svo þessi er fólk vilja nýta sér hérna spengina sjálf.
Já.
Það er bara fært að það er líka þessi.
Góðan dag. Góðan daginn og velkomin á þennan fund sem fyrir yfirskriftina Menntun og færni á vinnumarkaði. Ég heiti Katrín Ólafsdóttir og er fundarstjóri hér í dag. Við höfum eftir að heyra mjög áhugaverð erindi, ég vissum. Áætlunin svolítið, já, það verður nóg að gera hérna hjá okkur í dag, fram til klukkan 10:30. Við ætlum hér að ræða hvernig gerðar eru spár færni og mannaflaþörf á vinnumarkaði. Við munum fá innsýn inn í það sem gert í öðrum Evrópulöndum. Þetta hefur ekki verið gert hér á landi fram til þessa, en vonandi verður hér breyting á og þetta svona fyrsta skrefið í þá átt. Fundurinn hann einnig sendur út á Facebook, þannig ef eitthvað sem komst ekki á fætur þá getið þið sendið með á Facebook síðu Vinnumálastofnunar. En það ekkert eftir neinu að bíða. Ég ætla að biðja Þorstein Víglundsson, velferðarráðherra, að byrja að opna þessa ráðstefnu. Gjörðu svo vel, Þorstein.
Jó, góðan daginn. Það er sérstaklega ánægjulegt að sjá hversu vel mætt hérna sem undirstrikar mikilvægi þess viðfangsefnis sem hér tekist á við í dag. Það eitt sem við getum treyst sennilega öðru fremur á næstu árum og áratugum breytingar. Miklar breytingar á starfsháttum, miklar breytingar á efnahagslífinu okkar, miklar breytingar á þeirri færniþörf sem við munum þurfa inn í íslenskt hagkerfi og við getum valið að verða ofan á þeirri öldu breytinga með því að undirbúa okkur vel og skipuleggja okkur inn í hana eða verða undir henni. Og þetta mætti nú útskýra þetta stundum fyrir stjórnmálunum betur hvernig hérna breytingar virka en það hefur verið veruleg þörf á aukinni færnigreiningu á íslenskum vinnumarkaði. Við höfum allt of óljósar hugmyndir hvers konar menntunar við þörfnust inn í hagkerfið, hvaða menntun til staðar, hvaða færni jafnvel bara til skamstíma í hópi þeirra starfsmanna sem að hér streyma inn til þess að mæta hagvextinum sem við höfum búið við á undanförnum árum, en líka til lengri tíma litið að glöggva okkur betur á því hvert stefnum við og hvaða hæfileika þurfum við til þess að hámarka möguleika okkar þar. Þess vegna gríðarlega mikilvægt að þessu verkefni verði sinnt vel á komandi misserum og árum og ég þakka sérstaklega samtökum atvinnulífsins, Vinnumálastofnun, Alþýðusambandinu og Hagstofunni fyrir þá vinnu sem þegar hefur verið unnið og undirstrika mikilvægi þess að henni verði haldið áfram. Það mun líka reyna mjög á stjórnvöld þegar það kemur að vinna með niðurstöðu slíkra færnigreininga. Því að það annað sem vantar verulega á í íslensku efnahagslífi, það markviss stefnumótun stjórnvalda þegar kemur að menntun. Við ræðum gjarnan fjárveitingar til menntastofnana, en við ræðum afskaplega lítið það í hvað á að nýta þetta sama fjármagn. Hvaða menntun viljum við að skólarnir okkar séu að sinna? Hér hefur árum og áratugum saman verið talað mikilvægi þess að efla iðn- og starfsnám, en þegar við náum árangri þá fjármögnum við ekki árangurinn, þannig að nemendur jafnvel fælast frá námi aftur að því að skólarnir hafa ekki fengið þá fjárveitingu sem til þar til þess að taka við þeim. Og við vitum jú að í verknáminu, í iðnnáminu, í tæknináminu liggur miklu meiri kostnaður á hvern nemanda heldur en í bóknámi, en þeim kostnaði verða stjórnvöld að mæta ef við ætlum að vera ofan á öldunni, ofan á öldubreytingana á næstu árum og áratugum. Þess vegna fagna ég þessari ráðstefnu hér í dag, fagna þeirri vinnu sem þegar hefur verið unnin, en undirstrika að þetta bara byrjunin og við þurfum að gera svo miklu betur í þessum efnum á komandi misserum og árum. En hlakka til að vera hér með ykkur í dag og hlýða á þau áhugaverðu erindi sem hér og taka þátt í pallborðsumræðum að þeim loknum. Takk hérlega fyrir.
Þakka þér fyrir. Áður en ég kynni erlendu fyrirlesana þá ætlum við að skipta yfir í ensku og restin af fundinum mun vera á ensku. I'm going to switch over to English now, so our our guest speakers here today will understand what they're expected to do and when they're expected to give their talks. First on the agenda is Rob Wilson. Rob Wilson is a professor at the Institute of Employment Research at the University of Warwick. He's played a leading role in developing quantitative methods in how to anticipate changing skills in the labor market, both at the national and international level. He's going to talk about the lessons from 40 years of work in skills forecasting, both in the UK and other countries of Europe that he knows about. And I will put up, let's see if I can find the slides here. Rob, the floor is yours.
Well, I hadn't expected quite such a large audience, so I'm glad we've generated such a lot of interest in this, what I think anyway is a very important subject. The title of my presentation is slightly different from the one in the handout that you've got in front of you, but hopefully it will be clear what I'm trying to do in this particular presentation. But basically I'm going to try and cover three main areas. First of all, why we should bother to do skills forecasts in the first place. What use are they, and what they can and can't achieve. And I think it's important to be realistic about that, and that's one of the messages I want to try and get across this morning. Secondly, I want to say a little bit about how we go about it. I'm going to be talking especially about the quantitative employment projections that we've done at a European level. And then I'll say a little bit about some of the results that we get from doing that exercise. And I'll focus on in very broad terms on the results that we get at a European level, but I'll say a little bit also about Iceland, because one of the countries that we've been doing this work for is your own. So that's my plan. So why should we bother with forecasting? Well, if you live in England, then one of the things that you regularly listen to is the weather forecast, and the reason that you do that, of course, is because you want to know whether it's going to rain or not, and it rains quite a lot in England. The guy in the slide obviously has heard the forecast and he's prepared himself for rain. It doesn't look like it's going to rain, but maybe the weather forecasters know better. So that's essentially why we bother with forecasts. We're trying to anticipate the future and to prepare ourselves for it. Now, there are lots of reasons why people have suggested that we don't need to bother, and I'll just list a few of those now. Forecasting is impossible. And in a sense, that's true. Nobody can predict the future. Forecasting is unnecessary. If you believe in market forces, then surely the market will generate its own solutions, so why bother? Forecasts are inaccurate. Inevitably, that's also true. We can't do forecasts in great precision. And often they're based on invalid assumptions, and that may also be true. But I think most people who are engaged in this activity have managed to convince themselves and others that there are good reasons why we should not be dissuaded from doing forecasts for these kind of reasons. My favourite reason, though, for thinking that we shouldn't do forecasts is that in some countries they're actually illegal. You might not have realised that. That's true in my own case. If you look back in the history books, there was an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil spirits. This dates back to 1736, and as you can see, prediction of the future was illegal then, as is any pretense to such arts and powers. And that was because they felt that people were being misled. And fortunately at that time, practitioners were no longer condemned to death for this offence. But as you can see, the punishment was still quite unpleasant. So I'm glad I wasn't forecasting in those days. Fortunately, in the UK, that act was repealed, but not until 1951, which is actually the year of my birth, coincidentally. The Fraudulent Mediums Act modified the law at that stage and made it legal as long as it was done solely for the purpose of entertainment. So hopefully forecasters are in the entertainment business. So is systematic anticipation possible? As I've already said, I don't think we can predict the future with certainty or precision. And in some senses, all forecasts are inevitably wrong. In fact, often when I'm giving these presentations, that's the starting statement that I would make. But having said that, everyone can prepare and plan for the future. And that's not just governments and organisations, it's also individuals. And I think that's an important message also to take away from this. And of course, those plans and decisions help to determine the actual outcome. The future is not fixed. The future depends on the decisions that we make today. And we can influence the way in which we move forward into the future and where we end up. So in that sense, not only is forecasting possible, it's inevitable. We're all doing it all the time. And I think some kind of comprehensive, systematic, consistent set of projections can be a very useful way of explaining to individuals, decision makers, about the world that they live in and what may happen in the future. So, yes, forecasting I think is necessary. We live in a world of rapid change, there's a great deal of uncertainty, and clearly evidence of market failure in the past, the crisis of 2008 being a very good example of that. And we know that there are long lead times on investment in education and training. If you're thinking about doctors, for example, it's not just how long it takes to train a doctor. If you need to make sure you've got the right numbers of doctors being produced in the future, you may need to build a new medical school, and that can take decades. So that, of course, is the exception at the long end of the lead time spectrum. But all training and education takes time, and if we want to be in a position to make sure we've got the right kind of skills in the future, then we need to be thinking well ahead. So I think we need regular and systematic assessments of what the future is going to look like, and that can help to guide a whole host of things. It can guide and inform policy making at the governmental level. It can guide and inform decision making at an individual level. It can hopefully try to avoid some of the major mismatches and imbalances that we see in a number of our labour markets. And I think, therefore, the only meaningful question is not whether we should do forecasts, but how we should go about it, who should do it, and with what particular ends in mind. Now, there are obviously lots of different potential audiences for this kind of work, and I've listed some of them on this next slide. Typically, we begin by thinking about the government, the state, policymakers, and that's very much how this kind of work first started, when it was very much about planning the education and training system. But there are many other important audiences too. Education and training providers, thinking about what courses they need to put on, what the curriculum should look like. Companies and employers, what kind of issues are they going to face in the labour market? Where are the pressure points going to be? But I think increasingly important, and this has been recognised in many countries now, are the decisions that are being made by individuals about their future careers and the people who advise them, the careers guidance and advice counsellors. Now, our forecasts ideally would be customised and tailored to each of these different audiences. In practice, in most countries, that's not possible. In most countries, one set of projections are produced and they're intended to try and serve the needs of all these different groups. So, a little bit now about how we go about forecasting. The ostrich approach to planning. This guy's obviously heard about ostriches. In fact, I think ostriches have got rather a bad press in this regard. This is a picture of a real ostrich, and as you can see, it's got its head in the sand. Now, the reason for that is because it's protecting its eggs. So it's thinking about the future and trying to maintain the population of ostriches. So talking about ostriches as being a bad example of planning is really a misnomer. There have been all sorts of ways in which people have tried to predict the future. Gypsies at a circus or fair have their crystal balls. There have been lots of other methods, peering into the stars, looking at the entrails of animals and so on. Hopefully we've adopted now more systematic approaches to doing all of that. That includes the quantitative computer models that I'll talk a little bit about today, as well as other more qualitative techniques which can also be important. And those include things like Delphi methods and scenario development. And I think all of these techniques can be important in thinking about the way in which the world is changing and how we need to prepare ourselves for it. So I've listed here some of the main methods. Formal quantitative models, I think, are very important, but they're not the only tool that you need. They include things like extrapolating trends in data, analysis of time series information, trying to get some kind of behavioural understanding about how the world works. But there are other approaches as well. both quantitative and qualitative. They include surveys of employers, development of scenarios with different groups, and so on. But all of them have two things in common. And the key elements are, where are we now, and what happens next? And I think if you keep your eye on those basics, then you can do something useful. Now, the where are we now is a very important part of this. If you haven't got good data about the current situation, then you're going to struggle to produce any kind of decent forecast. So get the where are we now thing right is an important message to take home. And then the next question is, well, what happens next? And that's where the different methods about thinking about the future come in. Now, the way in which we've approached this in the European work I'll summarise is by using quantitative employment forecasts. And I'll say a little bit about how we do that. That's not the only method that you can use, and you may need to consider a variety of different methods if you want to get the best results. So the reasons we've concentrated on quantitative modelling are because I think there's always a natural desire to try and quantify and measure things. And a formal quantitative model has a lot of benefits. It ensures consistency, it ensures that our assumptions generally are explicit and made clear to people. And I think these kind of benchmark forecasts can be very useful. And there have been huge improvements, of course, in our ability to do this since I first started work in this area. When I was employed as a lowly research assistant, when I first started working, we put our programs on punch cards. I don't know how many people in the room remember those, but one of my jobs was to carry these punch cards across the campus. If I were to fall over and drop them, then the cards would get disordered and no one would know how to put them back together again. The computer that we ran the model on at that time took up a room not much smaller than this one. Nowadays we can do the whole thing on an iPad or a laptop computer. So there's been enormous improvements in our ability to crunch numbers and to develop these kind of quantitative models. And that's why I think most countries now regard some elements of quantitative forecasting as a key part of thinking about the future. Now, the work that we've done for CEDEFOP is basically dependent on two main elements. Our quantitative modelling approach basically is centred around a macroeconomic model, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's essentially a model of how the economy works that focuses on employment by sector. And I think sector is a very crucial part of understanding how the demand for skills will change. And secondly, there are various other modules which focus on the demand for and the supply of skills. How do we measure skills? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And we could probably spend an entire day talking about just that. Our focus is on two main indicators. We measure skills by the occupation, the job that people do, and we measure skills by qualifications, the kind of formal qualifications that people acquire as they go through the education and training system. We proxy the demand for labour and skills by employment, and we proxy supply by measuring the number of people who are economically active in the labour market and offering themselves for work. This is, I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see this all the way through the room. It's quite small, but the presentation is going to be made available on the website after the event. So if you have any questions about any of the detail of this, you can get back to me. My contact details are at the back of the presentation. I'm not going to go through this in great detail now. Just suffice to say that the blue blocks in the middle is our macroeconomic model, and this is at the heart of our system. And that essentially is used to deliver two main predictions. First of all, what's the pattern of employment going to be by sector? And we distinguish that at quite a detailed level. And secondly, what's the breakdown of employment by, the breakdown of labour supply by age and gender. So those two elements come out of this blue box in the middle, and then we've developed a series of other modules which are represented by the boxes on the sides, which deal with the demand for and the supply of skills. And we try to bring those together to get some kind of handle on what the imbalance mismatch might look like in the future between those two elements. So the macroeconomic model is an essential element in all of this. basically that's where we bring together the links between both the labour market and the rest of the economy, and also the links between one sector and another. The macroeconomic model provides a consistent framework for thinking about all these things and for bringing demand and supply together. And it tries to take into account what some of the key drivers that are influencing the economy and the labour market are. And many of those are of course, determined outside what happens in a particular country. What happens in the rest of the world is a key element here. So, why do I think skills projections are useful? Well, I think they can help us to understand past trends, how we've got to where we are at the moment, and they can help us to understand what the future may look like. What is the pattern of employment in the future going to look like? Where are people going to be employed? What sectors will they be employed in? What jobs will they be doing? And what are the education and training implications of that? What are the sorts of skills, qualifications that people will need? And can we, by doing that, try to avoid some of the worst problems of mismatch and imbalance? But it's important to recognise that there are some strong caveats that we need to make here. Any forecast of the future involves making a number of implicit as well as explicit assumptions about the labour market. And this is not a mechanistic manpower planning type exercise in which we work out what's happening in the economy and from that we can derive exactly how many plumbers we need to train or the numbers of nurses or doctors. The labour market and the economy are much more complex than that. There's all kind of behavioural and social relationships going on here which make it much harder to make a model that provides these links than is the case in, say, an engineering type situation where you can model the way an aeroplane works in a very systematic and precise manner. And finally, the important point I mentioned once already, that the future is not fixed or predetermined. So we produce these projections. They show us what the future may look like, but it doesn't have to be like that. And by changing choices and decisions, we can end up in a different place. So let me now turn to just summarising some of the results. As I mentioned, I'm not going to have time now to go through these in great detail, but the information is available in the handout, and there's a lot more information that lies behind that if you go to the website that's included at the end of the handout. So just a brief overview now. The main message I think that comes across is the rise of professional employment. The sorts of jobs that are illustrated in this slide here, by and large. So there's in a sense some kind of evolution going on here. On the far side of the diagram we have the sort of Neanderthal blue-collar worker, manual worker, gradually evolving into the professional with his briefcase and so on. That's obviously a caricature. The world is a lot more complicated than that. But that's one of the key messages that comes across from these kinds of results. The key elements that I'd focus on, I think, both in the case of Europe as a whole, and this slide represents the whole of the European Union, plus the three associated states, which include Iceland, as well as Norway and Switzerland. Now, one of the messages that comes across very clearly is the change in demographics. And what this particular slide illustrates is that we have an ageing population and an ageing workforce. And that's true for most of the countries within the European Union and the associated states. So that's one of the key things that we're facing in terms of the supply side of the labour market. When we think about the demand side, the employment by sector, which is what this slide illustrates, you can see that things are changing, and they're changing in some sense inexorably. These things are not going to be altered very much by what happens to government policy, but they're changing steadily in certain directions. And although our model distinguishes employment in a lot more detail than this shows the broad patterns. So at the top of the diagram, you can see the main growth area. The pale blue line is business and related services. And that is expected to continue to grow in importance. At the bottom, we have the primary and the agricultural sector. That's the blue dotted line. And that's continuing to decline slowly. Manufacturing, also declining slowly. The main growth, though, and the main concentration of employment nowadays in most countries is in the area of services. And so that's what's driving the pattern of demand for skills. In a bit more detail here, this doesn't go down to the full level of detail that we've got in the model, but you can see that the main messages are at the top part of the diagram, continuing job losses in primary and manufacturing industries, while in the bottom half it's growth in services, although the kind of austerity measures that were introduced after the crisis were very much impacting on employment in areas that were funded by the public sector, and that includes health and education in some countries too. So significant structural change by occupation is the result of that. And again, I think there are not many surprises here. The growth areas are the lines towards the top of the diagram, professional, associate professional groups, while at the bottom, the jobs that are disappearing are those in agriculture and in other primary industries, as well as categories like clerks, which have obviously been affected by the information and communication technology revolution. That's the purple line that's slowly going down in the middle. Obviously, if you look at these things in more detail, then you get somewhat more differentiated patterns of change. But most of the trends are fairly smooth and inexorable. Now, it's important, and another key message I think to get across, not just to focus on the numbers of people employed in these occupational categories. Often the change in those is quite modest, and this diagram, the black bars show the net change between 2016 and 2030 in employment in these categories. And you can see that in a few areas like clerks, craft and related workers, skilled agricultural and fishery workers, those lines are in the negative bar. So those are areas where employment is going to fall. But that's offset by replacement demand. Replacement demand reflects the need to replace people who will be retiring from the workforce. And even in those areas where the black lines are in the negative, you'll see that there's positive employment opportunities, because people are employed in these areas at the moment and they're going to need to be replaced over the next few years. So don't forget about replacement demand. We also work out the implications for qualifications. At the European level, because of the limitations of the data, we're only able to differentiate three broad groups. High qualification, which is basically degree level. Low qualification, which are people leaving school with very few, if any, formal qualifications, and then a group in the middle. Ideally, we'd like to differentiate much more finely than this, and certainly for individual countries it's possible to do that. But the messages that come through, though, are very clear. The main positive areas of employment change are at the high level. At the low level, certainly if you ignore replacement needs, expansion demands are negative. So the number of jobs for those lowly qualified people are slowly disappearing. But again, there are positive replacement needs, so the overall number of job openings is going to be positive even for those at the lowest qualification level. And that's very much driven by what's happening on the supply side. This slide here shows the broad patterns of change at those three broad levels for the whole of the EU, and you can see that the people qualified at the highest level are gradually growing in importance, both in terms of their absolute numbers and shares, whereas the numbers and shares of those with the lowest level of qualification are steadily declining. We tried to make some kind of comparison of mismatch and imbalance at EU level, and as you can see, there are mismatches that we're expecting to continue to be significant in the future. Let me just round off by saying a little bit about the results for Iceland. All of the results that I've talked about are available for each of the countries that we've done the forecast for, and that includes Iceland. Now, we're not experts on the Icelandic economy. We use data that come from the EU labour force survey that Iceland contributes to. We have a macroeconomic model that uses national accounts data that comes from Iceland too. And we use that to produce the results for this particular case. And I think they're indicative benchmark projections is how I would describe them. But just briefly running through the results, you can see the demographic change. There's also the same kind of increase in the aged end of the population spectrum for Iceland. At the sectoral level, we have rather more erratic changes in employment, particularly in the construction sector, which I guess is related to what happened in the crisis to some extent. And implications for particular sectors in Iceland. It's the food, drink and tobacco sector that has the best prospects according to our results. but banking is obviously one of the sectors that's clearly been hard hit by the financial crisis. The implications in terms of occupations, again, some quite significant changes going on there, and also replacement need demands very, very significant in the Icelandic case too. And then finally, some implications in terms of qualifications. Now, all of those results are available in much more detail on the CEDEFOP website. Details of that are included at the end of my slide. So if you go onto the CEDEFOP website link there, you can find all of this information. If you join SkillsNet, which you just have to give them your email address and one or two other details, there's no charge for membership, you can get access to the full set of results for not just Iceland, but for the whole of Europe. So hopefully that will stimulate your interest, both in what's happening at a European level, but also our initial thoughts on the situation in your own country. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I want to remind you that these slides will be made available after the talks. So if you miss something, there's always a chance to go back. But next on our agenda, let me see. Next we will hear from Sweden what the methods they use there. We have with us today Karin Grunewald, who's going to tell us about the system in Sweden. Karin works at the Statistics Sweden, where she works on skills forecasting. And as Rob mentioned before, in their study they use labor force survey data. In Sweden, I believe they use register data, which might be more appropriate for our use, but we will find out. Karin.
My name is Karin Grunewald, and I work at the Forecast Institute at Statistics Sweden. And the Forecast Institute is one of the key actors when it comes to forecast on skill needs in Sweden. And I have been invited here today to tell you more about the work that we do within this area. For some background, the framework for the work on forecasts of education and employment is provided in a separate budget document from the Ministry of Education, and where it says that Statistics Sweden shall analyze trends in the interaction between education and employment and be responsible for the ongoing work on long-term forecasts. And it's also stated that we shall do a comprehensive publication at least every 3 years. So, since 1972, the overall publication takes the form of a report. We call it Trends and Forecasts, whose last release was in December 2014, with a forecast up until 2035. And we are about to publish a new report now in December. And Trends and Forecasts describes the development and the long-term prospects in the areas of population, education, and employment. And the calculations are related to the whole labor market and all forms of regular education. And we base our calculation on register data. And the forecasts are made at national level. And in the recent years, we've also done regional forecasts upon request. But so far, we've mainly done it for regions with larger cities. So what we do, we divide the population into different educational groups based on each person's highest education. And this information comes from the Register of Educational Attainment of the population. So the forecast covers the supply and demand of approximately 100 educational groups, covering compulsory education, upper secondary education, and also post-secondary education. And we cover different fields of education, like healthcare, education, teacher training, IT, manufacturing, natural science, humanities, and arts. The aim of the calculations is to focus on the imbalances between the supply and demand, imbalances which may occur if the development continues along the current path. So this is not about trying to predict the future, but rather to highlight areas that may need policy changes in order to influence the future. And by given constant assumptions on the supply of skills, we mean if the education system remains basically the same as today, and if individuals make the same educational choices as today. So we do forecast over study completion based on the current investments in education and training, the number of graduates in each field of study, as well as the current enrollment rate. And we get this from the register data. The calculations of the demand is based on 4 components. It starts off with assumptions about the total employment development. That is, assumptions about people's participation in gainful employment in the future, based on register-based labor market statistics. Secondly, we do assumptions about the industrial development. Thirdly, we do assumptions about the occupational trend in each industry by looking at historical trends. Therefore, we have the occupational register. And fourth and final component is the assumptions on the future educational demands per occupation. So the final outcome on the demand side is the future demand by qualification. And this is how we present our results. 57 educational groups are presented in graphs like this, and other results are presented in tables. And this graph shows the predicted outcome for compulsory and upper secondary school teachers in Sweden in 2035. And we can see that there is a substantial risk for shortage for people with this type of education, as the demand, that is the blue line, is expected to increase substantially, and whereas the supply is expected to decline. But when you look at historical data, you get the impression that the current labor market situation is rather balanced. But that must not be the case, of course. However, we can't really quantify the current labor market situation by using register data or by looking at historical trends. So for that, we need other tools. For example, we have a survey called the Labor Market Tendency Survey, also performed by the Forecast Institute, an employer survey. And this is an annual sample survey, also published yearly since 1959, so it's a long time. And the main purpose of the survey is to provide information about the current labor market situation for approximately 70 educational groups. And the employers are asked questions like whether they have applied for staff in the recent year, and if so, how many. And we also ask them about their assessment when it comes to the supply of newly graduated applicants and applicants with work experience. And the employers state if they think there is a balance, a surplus, or a shortage in each educational group. So if we look at the previous picture once more, in Trends and Forecast, we use this survey, the Labor Market Tendency Survey, to get a picture of the current labor market situation for the educational group in question. So if there is a shortage today, with, for example, for this group, the results of the long-term forecast should be interpreted that the gap between the demand and supply would be even larger in the future, because try to illustrate it with another line, because there is a gap already today, but we don't really know the size of the gap, but there is some gap today already, so then there will be perhaps even worse in the future. What about the technology and the technical development? Do we take that into account? Well, we look at current trends, we look at historical trends, we do assumptions about productivity growth when it comes to the industrial development. However, when it comes to future innovations and new professions that may arise, we have no idea. And we do not dare to guess either, so in that sense, no, we don't. How trends and forecasts is used mainly as background information in discussions when it comes to skill supply and educational planning. However, when it comes to educational planning, it's important to note that in Sweden, the actual number of study places, the number of students, is decided by the educational institutions themselves. So it's not decided by the government. So the universities, the university colleagues, they're free to accept more or fewer students than the number financed by the government. And the educational institutions, they are more concerned with regional needs, local needs. And our analyses are mainly in national level. But as I said previously, we have done regional forecasts also on requests, and they have been very appreciated because they have been used as a common regional platform for the discussions about educational planning, and not only when it comes to higher education, also all kinds of education. And the forecasts we perform are also used by the Swedish Higher Education Authority, the Swedish Public Employment Agency, trade unions, of course, and career counselors and individuals, students who wants to know, what shall I study to get a job in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin. This was very interesting insight into how things are done in Sweden. I'm always very jealous when I hear about labor research in the other Nordic countries. They have a very long history, very good data, and I always find it very, very interesting what they're doing, but I'm also always a little bit jealous. So. But now we're going to go, if I can get this computer to work here. We are going to go to Ireland. Let me see. All right, I got it going. All right, last of the talks that we're going to hear today is from John McGrath. He comes from Ireland. He's manager of the Skills and Labor Market Research Unit, which is attached to FAS, the National Training and Employment Authority of Iceland. John has extensive experience in doing research on the Irish labor market, and he's also worked as a consultant in Europe and in Asia, and he's going to tell us all about how things are done in Ireland, right?
Well, first I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's my first time to Iceland, and so far I'm very impressed, and I'll certainly come back with friends and family. It's a very nice place to spend a little time in. When I was talking to your colleagues who kindly invited me, I was wondering how the Irish situation could help. We are a very small country. We're not as small as Iceland. Most European countries aren't. But there are only 4.5 million of us, roughly 2.1 million in the labour force. And unlike Iceland, you're a lovely country here. We don't have any mineral wealth at all, unless you call growing grass all year round a mineral wealth. But we've done remarkably well. Now, we are home for, I suppose, most of the major software companies in the world, a lot of the biopharma companies, a lot of the medical device companies. You would hear despite our small size, that Trump is regularly criticizing us these days, saying there are too many American companies there, bring them back and let them create jobs for Americans. He blames our corporation tax, which is 12.5%. I mean, don't kid yourself, that is not the lowest corporation tax in Europe. The de facto rate for France, I'd say, is closer to zero, whatever the nominal rate is. One of the reasons why they're all coming to Ireland is because we do take human resource development very, very seriously. We don't do any vocational training before the end of second level, because we believe the modern capitalist society requires people who are very autonomous, who are very independent, and who are very highly educated in a general sense. And then we do take, once they finish the second level cycle, we do take training them and educating them further into marketable skills very seriously indeed. I'm going to tell you now about the way we do that. It's as much, and I want to emphasize this, it's as much a political task as it is a detailed technical task. You have to have the absolute commitment of your government. The institutional structure is as important as the data structure, and you'll see that here. This is me here, the National Skills Unit. I am nominally located with the Ministry of Education and Skills. When I say nominally located, the government will pay us separately, always separately, because our task is to provide analysis to all of the public sector, every government ministry, and to do that in a neutral fashion. So we link into our Ministry of Jobs, IDA Ireland, Enterprise Ireland, all the development agencies, and of course we link in also to the Ministry of Welfare, to public employment offices and so on. We provide all of those with detailed data on, as Karen said, on the demand for skills and the supply of skills. So this is the institutional framework, which I'm emphasising is very important. The National Skills Council is made up of the top person in all of the relevant government ministries, not the second person. The Secretary General must be there. It is chaired by the Minister for Education and Skills in person. He never misses a meeting. And that, I suppose, gives the message of, look, we regard this as extremely important. That's me and my team, the SLMRU. I have to report directly to them. They set the work programme for me. There's only 8 of us, you know, and you'll see why when you have a major data warehousing system, how efficiently you can produce the analysis. I'm into the Economic and Social Research Institute. That's because, as Rob said, if you do forecasting, you have to have it's ultimately going to be based on a macroeconomic model which looks at outputs and productivity and allows you to do the overall forecast of employment. When you have that forecast, you can employ techniques that Rob and his colleagues in the University of Warwick many years ago have developed to perfection, like shift share analysis, so you can translate your employment forecast into employment by occupation forecasts. But Rob, I'm not going to go into the technical details of that. We have an expert group of future skill needs, and they are responsible really for the work of sector studies. Talk to your colleagues. I think sector studies will be one of the most important methodologies you can use. I think you have a feel that maybe you should be reorientating your industrial structure to maybe do a little bit of what we do, which is focus solely on high value added sectors. We don't get involved in wood processing or textiles or anything like that. We go very much for medical devices, biopharma and ICT. Integration is the key, as I say. We force those responsible for the supply of skills to go to, in a structural sense, to be brought together with those responsible for the demand for skills. I do work in a lot of other countries besides Ireland, and the constant problem is those people on the education side do not understand the labour market. And I would say certainly in Ireland that's true. I'm afraid it may not be true here, and I don't want to suggest it is, but I have encountered that problem a lot. I've encountered it with career guidance teachers as well. And it's true of Ireland. That's all I can say with authority. And therefore, we bring them together in a structural way. They meet 4 times a year, and it means that those on the supply side are privy to what is happening on the demand side of the economy, and they are joint guarantors of the policies then which are created. And I'll give you some good examples of those policies. So let's go on to the integration of data. We do that by we have developed in 2002 the National Skills Database. That is, in simple terms, electronic storehouse, which brings all data related to the demand for labour and the supply of labour together and programs them so they talk to each other. And that allows us to do the various analysis that we do, the forecasting we do, the publications we do, and the presentations that we do. So let me just talk about that National Skills Database. It's the biggest technical driver of the system in Ireland. The richest source of data in that, and I was pleased to meet some people from Statistics Iceland yesterday evening. As somebody who's worked in Ireland for so long on this, I managed this for so long, I have nothing but admiration for professional statisticians from the European statistics offices. We get all of the data from the Labour Force Survey and, of course, from our 5-year census. We get it in anonymised forms, in the most detailed form possible, because that allows myself and my colleagues to make the widest level of analysis. You might say, how the hell do you get that? What about data protection? But all our people every year, we all have to sign legal forms, many legal forms, which commits us to honour various publication thresholds. We get about 55,000 records. I will talk off-site, so to speak, with the statisticians if they're interested here on the actual detail. All the data, for example, all the job seeker data, all the vacancy data from the PES offices, all come to us. That's only a part of the data market, as you know, of the vacancy market, as you know. So I actually purchased data from the private sector, so we can do data mining exercises to get a sense of how a quantitative description of an occupation is de facto changing in qualitative terms. Obviously, we get all the data from our migration office, because our immigration policy is based on economic needs, so that becomes a proxy of skill need. We are responsible for the listing of occupations to the Irish government on the basis of which they determine what occupations qualify for work permits and what don't. Obviously, during the Celtic Tiger, we had an enormous amount of occupations which qualified, and then when we, how would I say it, we were like children in a sweet shop. After we became so rich, we made a mess of it, and we went into about 6 years of recession. But we are now at the fastest growing economy again in employment terms, but that is from a low base. That is from a very low base. We obviously, all of the education data, all of the enrollment data, all of the destination data is also sent to the database. We have what's called the data feeder group. It meets once a year under my management, and that brings together everybody who is obliged to feed the anonymised data, the microdata, into the National Skills Database together. And it means that any new data sources which are coming out, that can be brought in, and we also discuss the various electronic formats the data is sent to us. These are the main demand side data that we get. We get all the data from IDA Ireland and from Enterprise Ireland. So, for example, on a confidential data basis, we would know what American companies are going to come in next year, what their occupational profile is going to be, so we can anticipate that and we can prepare for it. The data classification, well, I'm like Rob. In the United Kingdom and Ireland, we use the SOC code rather than the ISCO code, but there's a translation between. If you were going down this road, you would use the ISCO code, presumably. So skills are approximated by occupation, and then by course, we use the international ISCO codes. So they're the two codes. If you were looking at the database now and you wanted to look at the number of nurses, let's say, working in Ireland in the southwest region who are non-nationals, well, you would look at that through the 4-digit code of nurses. I can't remember what it is now at the moment. And obviously, any data you provide is limited by the variables in the LFS. So take nursing. I wouldn't be able to tell you how many of them are Polish, but I would be able to tell you how many of them are from the accession countries or from the 15 traditional EU countries, older EU countries, or from the UK individually, or from Ireland, obviously, or from the United States. I think we have a United States variable. So obviously we're limited by the extent of the variables in the LFS, but you could do that instantly, more or less instantly. So it's a highly effective system. Now, linking research to policies is that allows us to monitor, as Karen was saying, replacement expansion demand against the supply, both unemployed job seekers on the PES register and also graduate supply. So we talked about replacement needs. Some people use what's called the age cohort approach to replacement need. We've got so much outward and inward migration, we tend to use transitions data to measure replacement. What transitions data means is simply, and this shows you the level of trust that's required to build a system like this. We actually have the unique identifiers of every record, associated with every record in the LFS. So we can follow them going from employment to unemployment, back to inactivity, inactivity to employment, and all of this. You know, we just compare it through adjacent quarters. And that gives us a vast amount of data, which is very, very useful. It's useful in terms, I'll move through this quickly now, because otherwise, in terms of understanding the vacancy market, understanding the demand market, that will come to, I suppose, about 550,000 vacancies filled. We've only got a workforce of just less than 2 million. But some of those vacancies only arise from turnover. And if your active labour market measures are focused on those vacancies, you're not achieving anything. They're just job changes, that's all they are. And what you want is you want the net difference in job changes, and you want the replacement rate, and you want the expansion rate. And you must be able to understand what each vacancy represents if you're going to make a real difference. So that's replacement. I might move it on quickly. These are just examples of turnover in Ireland. Sales, hospitality, you can imagine, construction and other. A lot of these too are what we would call labour shortages. They're not skill shortages, and therefore providing, expensive training programs. I think you the example. Were you given the example of the butchers in Ireland? We provided an extensive training program, but they weren't prepared to work in abattoirs, so it didn't really work out. So we actually bring in people from Brazil, who are very good in that type of work to work in our abattoirs. But that's an example of an expensive training program, which if they had looked at the analysis a little bit more carefully and the detail more carefully, they might have been able to avoid a waste of almost €1 million. That shows you what the turnover rate and the replacement rate is like. It's much higher in the lower occupations. Now we do the expansion demand forecast. We follow Robert basically in the University of Warwick, so I won't go into that. Here's our regular products. I brought one with me, but the important message I'm going to give you here is you can produce products like this very, very quickly if you have a database, a kind of warehousing of data system like you have in Ireland. We've very few people, yet we will produce many, many, many published reports, both on the demand side and the supply side. And we would do it, each of those reports would only take a few weeks to do, because we have the template and the data is already stored there, ready to be downloaded. We disseminate the data, obviously, in idiot-proof terms, because all of us, Karen, Rob and myself, we're all nerds, I suppose, of one kind or another. We're statisticians, and I mean, we produce huge reports, but it's the job seekers we're looking at, and they're not going to, if they read them, they won't understand them. So I would say, do these kind of idiot-proof type of things to make people understand what jobs will give you a very good career and what jobs won't. You see, we use this, a lot of people, I know Latvia do it as well, use this kind of green or red. If it's green, it means it's really growing, If you get a qualification as a software engineer, particularly in Ireland, you're going to get a very good job. This follows this I think one was designed at the time of the implosion of the construction industry, and basically it's saying, for God's sake, don't seek training in a construction-related vocational skill like bricklayers. Policy use, maybe I'll give you a few examples before I finish. We have a situation where people in Ireland, I'm afraid, are very snobbish. They want all the kids to go to university and become highly paid barristers. You know, that's really what they want, or doctors. Now, on my side, I don't want that. My government doesn't want that. We want them to become, high qualifications, maybe in software architecture, maybe we're going after big data analytics at the moment because it's something that's required in every sector. So we want them to change. So what we did is we actually used the snobbishness against them. We said, because it's highly competitive to get into university in Ireland because all the kids want to go and all the parents want them to go. So we said, if you do advanced applied mathematics in second level, we'll give you twice the number of points for access to the university, twice the number. Now, our concern is, will they do a STEM discipline when they get to the university? That's the trick. I'm not sure. But we got a huge increase in the number of kids that did applied mathematics at second level. A huge increase, because they saw the benefit that they would then get more points than the people they were competing for, and they would get to the university of their choice. And what's the weaknesses of this? Well, it's all, and Rob mentioned this as well, and I agree with him entirely. The trouble about this type of approach is it's quantitative. You need also the qualitative one, because if I'm looking at something like, let's say, a civil engineer in quantitative terms, the reality is the tasks associated with a civil engineer will have evolved. It will have evolved, and you want that qualitative dimension to the ISCO code. So what we are now starting to do, CDFOP is, and Rob's involved, I think, we're doing data mining. Here's the data mining of a vacancy database called irishjobs.ie, which I buy in, and it's on software engineering. And the idea here is to try to find, well, what kind of programs are most demanded by employers in Ireland. So we use data mining to help us, but we've also developed another structure, which we called the Regional Employer Skills Council. And this simply brings employers and the providers of education and training together in a structural way in each of the 8 planning regions in the country. This is to get bottom up sources of skill needs and qualitative sources. And I think and this has only just happened. It takes a long time to really develop a proper system, but I think that dimension is very, very important. Also for evaluation, we use integrated databases. We don't use follow-up surveys anymore, although they can give you some qualitative information. But we use the unique social insurance number of everybody to follow people through their career by accessing a number of administrative databases with the help of Statistics Ireland. I physically place researchers with Statistics Ireland in order to make sure that we adhere to protocols on data protection, because we're looking at, for example, the databases from the Taxation Authority. That's for the employment, as well as obviously for unemployment databases and education databases. So they're just difficult to fill vacancies. And I just see that if you want any information, because I know myself and my colleagues have to be quick in giving just a very quick overview of this, you're very welcome to contact me at killboy@indico.ie, and that's my email address. So thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. We now have insight into here we go. Insight into how these things are done in the different countries around us. We do have a luxury problem in that we are a little ahead of schedule. So I thought I think many of you are in need to stand up and move around a little bit, but we're only going to make about 7-minute break. And then we'll come back with panel discussion. Jæja. Ég ætla að biðja ykkur að fá ykkur sæti svo við getum haldið áfram með pallborðið. Ef þið eru með spurningar til pallborðsins þá ætla ég að reyna að koma þeim inn á eftir þannig að þið látið mig vita. En þá ætla ég að skipta aftur yfir í ensku svo að allir skilja það sem ég er að segja. I will switch over to English so you understand what I'm saying. I'm going to ask you different questions, but if you want to comment on another question, just let me know and I'll give you the floor. I want to start with you, Rob. You told us why we should do these forecasts and even though they're illegal, which I found very interesting. But I wanted to ask you, is there a downside to this? If you make a forecast like this and there's a problem with the forecast, but everybody follows the forecast, could it have adverse effects and lead us into trouble, so to speak?
Okay, that's a tricky one. It's certainly been of concern in some countries. In Germany, for example, there was a reaction against some of the early skills projections they did for exactly that reason. That they felt there was a reaction of people to the projection which caused problems. I'm not sure whether that should dissuade us from doing this kind of activity, though. As I said in my presentation, I think what we're trying to do is to paint a picture of the way the world might look in the future. The Americans have been doing this kind of work longer than anybody else, and they very much emphasize that it's caveat emptor. They spend an awful lot of time and effort producing the projections, but then it's up to people to use that information along with all the other information that they have at their disposal to make their choices and decisions. And sometimes those decisions won't still be the right ones, but at least they're better informed about making them. So I think although it can cause difficulties, generally speaking, that's not the main problem with doing this kind of work.
Thank you. Thorstein, I want to turn to you. This is something we haven't done before, and we're thinking about doing it now. John talked about the importance of institutional framework. I'm just interested where you come from toward this. You seem to be the first minister in a long time who's actually interested in this, as far as I know. How do you see the future in this kind of work and in the institutional framework that we have?
Well, we have spent quite a lot of time, we were just discussing this before the panel started, we probably spent the last 20 or 30 years debating on whether and then how we should do this. Mm-hmm. And that tends to be something we spend a lot of time in Iceland doing. We never start. And that is, I think, the real problem here. We are, I firmly believe that life is what happens while you're busy doing other plans. So, of course, you can't forecast everything. But we are wasting a lot of resources in our education system by not pointing people in the beginning in the sort of generally right direction, what skills are needed. And we have different areas. It's fairly easy to forecast the educational sector and the needs there, and our health sector and our needs there. We run into more inaccurate areas when we are trying to forecast what will happen in the technological area and what specific kinds of skills will we need. But at the same time, we are not giving any guidelines today for kids throughout our education system. We're not we don't have the resources to educate the schools themselves on what advice to give. And that is a terrible waste of resources, because we know we will be strained for resources in many areas, and there's always this constant demand for further funding into our education system, in our healthcare system. And although the demand or the need is there, we also need to make sure that we are using funds more sensibly. And like I said in my opening remarks, it is troubling to see that government is really delegating our educational strategy towards our educational system, saying we're offering you a lot of money, do with it what you want. And I don't think that is an acceptable approach anymore. We need, together with businesses, with trade unions, with the educational system itself, to be much more strategic in where we are focusing our energies. And therefore I think we should start now. And we can find out along the way or make improvements on our approach along the way, but we have to get started, and I think this is an excellent starting point.
All right, thank you. I just realized I forgot to introduce the panel. We have Rob Olsen closest to me, then we have Ari Kristinn Jónsson, rektor í Háskólanum í Reykjavík, Þorsteinn Víglundsson, og síðan kemur Ásta Fjellsteð frá framkvæmdastjóri Viðskiptaráðs og svo Gylfi Arnbjörnsson á endanum. Ari, I want to come to you next. Thorsteinn mentioned that we're wasting resources in the education system. First of all, do you agree with, are we wasting resources, and what can we do, and how can a skills forecast help us in deciding what kind of education we want to offer in the university system?
So I fully agree with Thorsteinn that we have not been strategic in the development of our educational system when we look at the system overall. And we've done this the Icelandic way, which is let's put a bunch of money into this, let's set up the places, let's hire some people, cross our finger and hope it all works out somehow. And one of the things that you notice when you look at the situation today, and especially the growing mismatch that we see in terms of the needs of the industry, for example, for vocationally trained people, for technical education at the higher level, etc., there haven't been any messages to the students about what path they should take, what the paths offer, etc. So again, even when it comes to the students selecting which way they go, we're counting on it somehow all working out, and it won't. What we need to do is to provide much better information. Provide the information to the individuals who are making the choices, both the parents and the students themselves at the various points. We need to provide information, and actually we should make demands of the education system about what it provides to society in return for the funding that it's provided. And then we also, and this is maybe the most important point about the educational system, we need to make it more flexible. We're still working with a structure that was set up to a large extent over some decades in the middle of the 20th century. And when we stand at the cusp of an industrial revolution, when we look at all of the changes that have happened just in the last couple of decades here in Iceland, having an educational system that is still rooted in the boxes and the structures and the fences that we have in place today, we see that we need to make this much more flexible. We need to allow students to flow more easily between different types of education, and we need to be able to bring people back into the educational system so that we can respond to changing needs in the future. Because even if we inform the individual to the best extent we can, even if we have the forecast for everything, even if we have the strategy from the government in collaboration with industry and education in terms of trying to see where we go, we will get some things wrong, and we need to be able to rectify that as the world changes, because as Thorsteinn said, while we're busy doing something, the world will happen, life will happen, and we need to be able to respond to that, and for that we need a more flexible system as well.
All right, thank you. Ásta, I want to go to you next. From the employer side, what can you gain, or what would employers gain from having this kind of forecast? And is it a tool that you can use, or is it just a theoretical exercise?
I celebrate this discussion. I think, just as has been mentioned here previously, what is a challenge for Icelandic people always is to look ahead and look long term and plan for the future. I think it's something that is in our nature. We are a fishing nation. We're used to just, once the sun opens up, we can go out there and fish and catch the big fish of the day. We are very spontaneous, and that's actually a quality that we hold. But in order to predict the future and be ready for the future, we need to start looking more ahead and long term. And this is what I see from the discussion here for today with Karin. 40 years in Sweden looking at these things, seeing now with McGarth in Ireland, where they've actually decided what they want to be good at and what's their value proposition for the people in the country and also for others who want to be employed in Ireland or have opportunities there. And this is where I kind of think there's one point that comes before this kind of forecast is Iceland ready to decide where do we want to be in the future? What do we really want to be good at? And I think being just 1/3 of a million, we are obliged to take this decision and discuss it in a proper manner. And this is where the politicians come in, of course, in a strong way. And they need to be agreeing about these things and looking into the future and saying, we're going to go there. And this needs to kind of drizzle through the educational system down to the first grades. And I think we could look to countries such as Ireland as a role model because they've really done this well. Me, myself, being a mechanical engineer, working with a completely different skill set now at the Chamber of Commerce, I still see that the key kind of skills that are needed today are skills that we need to think about for our educational system. And this is, has been mapped from the World Economic Forum. And number one is complex problem solving. Then comes critical thinking, creativity, people management. How are we preparing our kids and young people to have these qualifications in our educational system? I think we need to think about that.
Thank you. Before we take questions from the audience, I want to go to Gylfi and ask him, is this a tool for the members of ISE? Is this something that is going to be helpful in your work?
Well, if I might, before I answer the question,
Sure.
It's interesting that I was 12 when the Swedes established their institute. So I had to start my career in the labor market without having any guidance of what to do. And like Thorsten said, we have been discussing this very heavily the last 20 years here in Iceland, whether or not we should, and we're still contemplating it 45 years later. Now it's interesting because Ireland is not the only fastest growing economy of the world. We tend to compare Ireland and Iceland, and the IMF is certainly doing so. And we muddling through in total chaos, and Ireland being so structured that they are, and we are both doing very well. So it sort of gives you a point in that it could be interesting just to analyze that and compare. Is it really necessary? Because what I feel that we have to bear in mind, and I agree with my colleague here, that doing the projections using historical data to continue is good. But the problem with that is that it cannot anticipate structural changes and sort of paradigm shifts in society. And I think sort of the fourth industrial revolution is of such a scale that we will have difficulties in calculating that implication. And certainly, I think for my members, it is very important. We have never figured out where we want to be. We tend to, come into situations. We have come into the situation that tourism is now by far the largest sector in the economy. And I've been following this discussion for the last 25 years, and I've never registered that we wanted to do that. It just happened. Now, there are certain things that have helped us in that, volcanoes and Björk and everything. And I'm not saying that this is something we would have avoided, but this is something that just happened without us preparing for it. And hence, we have no labor to support this. We are importing labor by the magnitude. So in 1995, OECD had discussions on the job study and was visiting what kind of skill, how can we secure the necessary dynamics of the economy to support new jobs. It was a very valuable job. We took part in that from my organization. I was the head of the economic department at that time. And we came out with the proposal in 1995 that we need to formulate an industrial policy for Iceland. We need to set a scope, where do we want to go? And we are still trying to put pressure on politicians that we should do that. So yes, I believe that we have to do that. I believe that we want to know where we should want to know where we want to go, and then plan for it. And I agree that the future of skills will not be the specific task, but the ability to address the change. And they mentioned the sort of main issues of that. And this cannot be left only for the educational system. So I think what they're doing in Ireland is very interesting. I think we should take this as a challenge, because we need to combine the social partners on both sides, the politicians, and the educational system to set down, not with barriers, but to figure out what is needed here, to understand each other's arena and to combine it.
Thank you. Before I take any comments from the audience, has any of you wanted to comment on what's come up so far? Well, we
just
do
a
have
quick comment on just to continue with Gilvi's point is we all see that we are becoming a global community, and I want to talk about this quickly, global competitiveness, meaning that we need to be here in Iceland globally competitive. We are truly competing with other countries for labor force, and as Gilvi is mentioning, we're so few, and the labor participation rate is one of the highest in the world, both for men and for women. So there's a limitation for how many more we can get to the labor market. So this is where we need to think about the environment. And I think part of this is not just the school, the educational system, the salaries and the jobs, but it's the cultural environment, it's the international schools, so we actually are attractive to people to come here with the knowledge that we want. And this is where you can see also great cases in Ireland for. So just want to add to that note.
Can I just pick up on a couple of points? I think it's absolutely crucial to recognise that skills forecasts of the type that we've all been discussing are not a panacea. They're not going to solve all of our problems. And I don't think anyone engaged in that kind of activity would pretend that they do. But I think developing some kind of labour market information and intelligence system of the kind that John has outlined for Ireland in particular is an important part of informing our citizens about the world as it currently is and how it may change in the future. I don't think we can plan the system and work out exactly where Iceland's going to be in 5, 10, 20 years' time. But you know, everyone has to do that implicitly. It's a question of whether they think about it explicitly or not. And I think it's a useful exercise for everyone to engage in that. And I think at the highest level, at levels of government, as well as at individuals making choices at school, it's useful to go through some kind of scenario development exercise. My wife is a careers guidance counsellor. She works with kids at school. And she's obviously aware of the kind of work that I do. So she's got quite a good understanding about the economy and the labour market, which is useful. But at the end of the day, she has to go and talk to the kid about, realistically, where are they at school? How able are they? What are they interested in? What would they like to do? I think someone said earlier, everyone wants to be a doctor or a barrister. Well, that's fine, but not everyone can actually achieve that. So it's a matter of exploring what the possibilities are and then working out a plan that is right for that kid. And it's the same for countries. These kind of discussions need to go on at the highest level. And again, you can't guarantee the outcome, but at least you can think seriously about it and try to make sure that you end up in a better place than you might otherwise do.
I think one of the things we really need to, although, like has been pointed out, we cannot plan for everything, we need to set long-term goals. And I think for the first time, at least in my lifetime, we sat down after the financial crisis and started wondering how do we want to revive the economy? Where do we want to be in 10, 15, 20 years' time? And the result was the McKinsey report, where we wanted to build our economic revival on a knowledge-based economy, saying we need to focus more on a knowledge-based economy. And we actually, for the first time, had the entire political community, employers, trade unions, educational system working together on developing a long-term strategy of where do we want to be in 20 years' time. And that makes it quite a lot easier to plan for what skills will be required for that future. But we got sidetracked by a booming tourism industry, which was great. It lifted us out of the recession that we were in. But we need to get back on track. The facts are still the same. We cannot build a future just on a resource-based economy. If we want to maximize the value added in the economy, if we want to provide Icelanders with the living standard that we all desire, we need to get back on track. And we need to pick up the report and say, well, okay, where did we leave off roughly about 4 years ago, and what do we need to do now, next?
If I may just, add a little bit onto that, because one of the things you sometimes get the feeling, here in Iceland is that people don't believe that a strategy can actually have any kind of impact because we're just going to get volcano tourists or something like that messes everything up. That's not true. The strategy, as Thorsteinn said, we should pick it up again. And we have examples of what can happen when the needs of the industry are documented really well. People are willing to respond to that and talk to compulsory education sectors and high schools about that. And the information technology sector in Iceland is one example of that. Over the last 10 years, in response to the demand by industry and society, the universities here have about quintupled the number of graduates coming out of that. That is purely a strategic decision, and it can't lead to changes in the behavior of people. But then you need to put it down and you need to work on it.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Go ahead.
Hi. It's not working.
Should be on.
Hello. Hello, my name is Erla Ósk Ásgeirsdóttir. I'm the Director of HR and Quality at Icelandair Hotels. I want to thank you for this conference. I think it puts focus on the things we should be focusing on, like skills, and database-driven decisions are always better than assumptions. I want to say, as a representative from the hospitality industry, that our industry lacks education that suits the industry, and we are suffering because of that. And I think the public sector and the universities are moving far too slow, and there should be more talks between the educational system, the public, the governors, the government, and the private sector. We have, at Icelandair Hotels, we have analyzed all our positions and have skills for every position within the company. We run our own school so we can meet the demands of the industry because the public sector is not serving as well as it could. And vocational education is the biggest part that is suffering, and the government put focus on the vocational education, I think, 5 years ago. And since that, the students attending vocational education has decreased 7%. So you need to put more funding into the vocational education if you want to change the system, and if you want to affect the turnout and what decision students take, and when they are trying to decide what focus to take.
Do you have a question for the
yes,
panel?
I think because I just want to, this is an opportunity to get all these people together and they can maybe hear our voice. And when I was listening to John McGrath, I was just thinking, why don't we have a platform that the private sector and the public sector and the government has, where they focus and do the strategy together, because that is important. So the education serves the industry, serves the private sector. How do you think we can do that? And how many years do you think that will take?
Did you want to answer your question?
Can I say
You
something?
can, yeah.
I think it's absolutely essential to recognise that sectors are a key element in what drives the pattern of demand for skills. So I think having some mechanism that you can hear the sectoral voice is absolutely crucial. So I very much go along with what's being said there. I think that there are also some concerns and dangers, though. Sectors are obviously interested in their own position, and governments have to take a broader perspective about what's good and right for society as a whole. So there's a balance to be struck between who pays for training and education. The government is obviously responsible for general education and training, and it's important that our young people are provided with the right general skills that they need to survive in the labour market and to survive in life in general. There comes a point, though, where the investment in specific skills for a particular sector, it becomes the responsibility of the sector itself. And so that balance has to be struck somewhere. But I think it requires a dialogue between the sectors and the state to work out exactly where that balance lies.
I fully agree with you that there is a necessity of joining these forces, as I said earlier. And Thorsteinn mentioned that we have this arena. Actually, the McKinsey report wasn't ordered. McKinsey, it was a pro bonus from McKinsey to take Iceland and analyze it based on both Norwegian and Danish, Swedish reports. So it was a pro bonus offering us this, but in some sense, after the crash in 2008, we did sit down in 2009. We did manage to make here a stability pact between the labor market, or the social partners, and the government on how to come out of this crisis. Actually, that has now become sort of a role model for the IMF on how to handle crises in societies if we can manage to build consensus on where to go. And we are good at that. We are good at coming out of crisis, but we're also very good at coming into them. That's the problem. Now, we have been sidetracked in that vettvanginum, this field. Yeah, we have this all the social partners, the educational system, the biggest companies, the politicians, all of the ministers, and all of the parties, regardless of being in opposition, are at the table. But we were sidetracked partly by taking issues that are highly political, tax issues, for example, whether or not we should have equalization in the tax system. This is a very good way to sidetrack things. But the problem is here in Iceland that we had elections 10 days ago, and another one last year. We have a political crisis. We have difficulties in getting the focus of the politicians on where to go. And we have to accept or acknowledge that we as a nation have not come out of the crisis. So we are putting demands on politics that has nothing to do with future planning. And because of that, it is very difficult for politicians to come up with a program because it's not in demand by the voters. And this is a difficulty. Until we can figure this out, how the politicians will actually gain something political from taking such a futuristic view, until then we will have short-sightedness in proposition and promises in elections. So this is a sort of a contradiction that we are facing in our society, and because of that, we are bound to meeting whatever comes around the corner. And we have been good at it, along Ireland, being planned, but this is something that we have to address. That's probably the answer, why haven't we figured this out? I think we have to face it that the vocational training system has to be more linked to the social partners than to politics. And the idea of combining the formal, old-time Latin education with the vocational system as we do in the secondary system has to be revisited because it's destroying the vocational system gradually. And this is something that we, the social partners, have to face and take the discussion with the politicians. Now, we have to do something about this.
Ásta.
Yeah, just quickly. I think maybe we also have been lacking a bit the sense of urgency of these changes that are happening. So the fourth industrial revolution, all these technological changes, the globalization and so forth. What we see, and was just shown here on the screen earlier, is the change in demographics. This is happening everywhere in the world, and Iceland is no exemption there. What I would like to see and hear more about is how we're going to adapt the educational system to these changes. We're seeing people in the labor force around 50 years old, and they are getting outdated technically. They need an upgrade to be able to continue to work, because we are getting more healthy, we're living longer, and we need to think about other parts of the demography and not just the young generation. So that's another challenge I think we should be taking much more into account when talking about reinventing and doing more for the educational system.
Þorsteinn.
Well, Gylfi talked about a political crisis and being the politician on the panel. Maybe I should try to defend, but he's absolutely right. I think, I mean, our biggest challenge is a political crisis or a lack of political leadership and vision. We have had 3 general elections over a time span now of 4 years, sorry. And the campaign for each of these elections has been completely different. We have not been debating the same topics in any of them. And that means politicians they're not leading the way. They are asking the voters what they want them to do. And that is never a good course of action. And there is a famous saying in sort of business strategy, show me the way and I will lead you there, for I am your leader. And that is never good. And we are lacking vision and visionary thinking in politics, and we need to take a much longer term focus on what we want to do and how we want to get there. And that is something we are not doing. To the question that was asked, in such a small society, it's relatively easy to bring together trade unions, businesses, the educational system itself, and make strategy on where do you want to go. How are we going to deal with this situation that we are dealing with at the moment? And as Gylfi said, we are excellent in dealing with crisis, and that is usually when we sit down together around the table and say, okay, what are we going to do now? But we are a society with, I would say, we are a society with ADD, attention deficit disorder. As soon as we get out of the hole we are in, we lose focus again, and we stop thinking about what we were doing a year ago, 2 years ago, or where we wanted to head in the first place. And running an educational system like we are doing today will not work because it is disconnected from business, trade unions, and the educational system itself. The input of teachers and the educational institutions isn't nearly enough, and we need to improve on that.
Ari.
So this is actually an excellent point to raise a lot of discussion. So one of the things, about the elections over the last 4 years, the campaigns have been about different things. Not one of them has been about where Iceland's going to be in 10, 20, or 30 years. Not one. But this, I mean, we've been aware of this issue in terms of the education for the hospitality industry basically since the boom started. And the responses are coming in slowly to the extent that we can. At the university level, we have programs already in place. We're starting new programs as well, et cetera, et cetera. But this is an excellent exercise. because this is the way that the world is going to be over the next decades due to the fourth industrial revolution. There will be large-scale changes that take place, and we need to set up an infrastructure and a system in our society so we can respond quickly to it. That means that there needs to be a much quicker discussion. You know, we can use the growth forum that Gylfi has mentioned, or another platform, to bring everybody together and talk about the steps that we want to take. We need to enable the education system to be much more flexible and quick to respond than it is today. And if I look at the universities, which do need more funding, but they also need to be able to have the freedom to respond to these kind of issues. Just the model for funding from the government today means that we're getting paid for what we were teaching 2 years ago, not the students that we need to bring into the universities or other schools at this point in time to respond to the need of industry. Let's take a look at the old system and make it more flexible so we can actually respond to the changes that will be happening over the next years.
Thank you. I want to go to the back of the room, to a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Jón Torfi. I'm a former academic, and I'm very grateful for this discussion. And I think it's quite impressive that you have a lot of social partners actually getting together. My question is about how do we use data? And I've been, which I'm normally not, but quite impressed by the Icelandic speakers, the way they expressed to me all the right things. I mean, the minister said what he said at the beginning, and Ari Kristinn, and in fact all the rest. To me, he said all the right things. And what this means is that we know a lot already, but how do we actually react? How do we actually do the things we know that should be done? And I think that's normally the problem with data. Data seems to be very useful, but it's very difficult to use. So the question is, how do we make sure that the people actually react to the information and the data they already have, and we know already a lot? And that brings us to the very nice presentations we had, and they were about technical issues, how we collect data. But the problem I was sort of grappling with, and even though John McGrath mentioned examples, the question came to my mind: how are we going to use it? Who is going to use it? And how is it going to be used? How is it going to be taken seriously? And I think that discussion also needs to be in there. And then we can also discuss what data should be used. Asta mentioned that she had changed her skill set from her basic education to what she's doing now. And we have data, I think, all our presenters know this, that a lot of us change skill sets, probably 5, even 10, possibly 15 times during our lifetime. And how should we think about education from that perspective? And that is also a very important part of the information we should actually collect. Ari Kristinn actually mentioned this when he talked about the importance of coming back to education. So the question is, how do we ensure that we use the education we know, the information we have?
Okay, who would like to start with this one? Maybe I'll give it to Gylfi wants to.
Thank you, Jón Torfi. You're an asset. I think the reason that we are not using the information that we actually have is because of the limited funding of what we need to do. We need to have the best universities in the world. That's the sort of the goal the University of Iceland has defined, be among the best 100 or something. We have still the country in Europe that have the highest number of people on the labor market that has not finished secondary education. We are still at 1/4 or 1/3. We have a totally underfunded vocational training system. Now, although we can agree upon these things and we agree upon the data, when we then try to continue having the lack of funds, we are divided. We are all struggling with the politicians of getting that funding. Now, in 2001, we established our educational institution on the of social partners, and at that time, the Ministry of Education didn't have any policy on in education unless it was operating their own schools. So the informal educational system, which is very large here in Iceland, was not part of the educational policy. And I tend to look at it, it is still so. Our discussions with the Ministry of Education in that respect is still on the basis that that ministry doesn't have any overall educational policy. And because of that, we have difficulties in continuing using that data to come to sensible decisions on what to do.
Thank you. Ari, on the data.
Now, data is always useful, but I'm a little biased there, you know. So one of the things that we should look at, and we should actually look towards all of the examples that we've seen here today, the European studies that are being done, what is being done in Sweden, what is being done in Ireland. All of these are mechanisms to create fairly clear insights into how things are developing. If we can combine that with a strategy for the future of Iceland, as well as with a projection about what the skill sets are needed and going to be most sought after in the future, then we can actually step outside of the funding issues. I'm not making light of the funding issues. We know that we need to fund better various aspects of the educational system. But the first step is to see a trajectory that we need to settle on together. And if you can inform individuals who are making these choices about what the opportunities are in the future, what different choices in their education will lead to, then you've got a starting point for us to actually start settling on the trajectory where we need to go and where we want to go. So if we use the data to really inform, create information out of all of this data, then we can really use that to set us on trajectory. And I believe that with a concerted effort, then we will figure out the funding that is needed to support that. But make this available. Let us all look at it, all the students, all the schools, industry, etc. Let us participate and let us then use that to set a trajectory.
Rob, do you want to comment on the data?
Yes, I mean, as I think John said, I'm a bit of a nerd, so as far as I'm concerned, you can't have too much data any more than you can have too much education. But I think we need to focus on something I mentioned earlier about developing a labour market information and intelligence system, and let's focus on the intelligence bit. You can have too much information. You can have information overload. So it's important that someone is trying to make sense of all of this and is disseminating it in a way that sends, as John illustrated in his presentation, some clear messages to the people that we're trying to influence. Now, as I said in my talk, there's a range of different audiences here, and I'm not sure we can always understand exactly how each of them is going to use this information. But clearly at the top level in terms of government, state, government departments, they're having to make decisions, strategic decisions about policy in education, training and a whole host of other areas. And hopefully they can use this information to make better and more informed decisions. But I think it trickles down to a whole range of other users and education and training providers. I think in many countries that is something that is delegated to a more micro level. In Sweden, we heard that universities make their own decisions about what courses to put on, but they need to be informed about what's going on in the labour market. They can't make these decisions in isolation. And the more reliable information we can provide to them about what these key trends are, then the more likely they are to make the right choices. Now, they won't always make the right choices. Inevitably, people will make wrong decisions. But we can't blame that on the forecast, the projections, the data. At the end of the day, people have to make their own decisions. But I think the better we can inform them about the world they face, the better those decisions will turn out to be.
Ásta. Yeah, just quickly. For Jón Torfi's question, I would like to use the data to measure what we have as in terms of diversity and jobs and so forth in sectors with productivity. I want to refer back to McKinsey report that Minister Rilusson just mentioned. That was the key element of the report, was that Iceland needs to improve their productivity. And this is a challenge that we are still confronted with. This is something we need to take into account. We've been blessed with the tourism, but it's not going to last forever. And if we want to keep a sustainable growth in the economy, we need to track productivity. And this would probably play pretty well with this data collection to see what are the jobs that are low productivity jobs, which are the ones that are high productivity, and where do we want to place us.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but I want to give Thorstein a chance if you want to make some famous last words. So I put you on the spot here.
Literally. No, I think Ásta framed it really well. I mean, the key in the end is productivity, and that is what we really need to improve in Icelandic society. Education will be a key driving factor there, but we need to be much more focused, much more strategic on where we are heading in that direction, and we are lacking still that long-term vision on where we are going, and that is always a dangerous path. We cannot rely solely on well, in Iceland you can rely a little bit on volcanoes going off every now and then, but it's not a good course of action, and I think we can do so much better.
These were very nice last words. Before we go, I want to thank the speakers today. I want to thank the panelists, but I also want to thank the organizers of this conference. So thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we will see this materialize in the near future. Thank you very much.
Interesting discussions.
Very interesting discussions, yes.
Hopefully it will be the start of something longer term.
I do hope so. Like you said, I mean, it's true we've been talking about it for 20 years, and we need to do something. Well, according to what I heard today, I mean, we have everything that we need. So we just need to push the
will seems to be there as long as you can get the new government to take it up.
It's the financing part that is the thing. I was trying to get into that, asking more about the importance of financing for that particular project. I guess that is very important.
Skal við þakka kærlega fyrir. Það er bíðilegt.
Well, certainly got a good turnout, so hopefully we're interested in what we all have to say.
We'll get the numbers on how many people are watching online, and we can sort of record it. So. We're going to come out and let them on.
So are we continuing here or can we meet somewhere else?
We can have some coffee or you can go to your room. We're going to meet for lunch downstairs.
Okay.
And then we will continue in the room downstairs.
So what time is lunch?